Welcome. Another year, another series of FO Exclusive. A very, very warm welcome to all of you in 2025 to our first edition. It is January 29th as we record it, Wednesday, January 29th, 12 noon in Washington, D.C. and in Boston, where Glenn sits. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me is Glenn Carl. He's a retired CIA officer, author, noted author actually, and now a senior partner at FOI, which is a political and geopolitical risk advisory. Glenn, how is 2025 looking?
When one has nothing nice to say, one should say nothing. So I am sitting silent.
Excellent, excellent. Very good. Today we have two big issues instead of three. Number one, Donald Trump launches an explosive imperial presidency. Number two, Chinese AI startup DeepSeek sparks global frenzy. So, topic one, Donald Trump launches an explosive imperial presidency. Donald Trump has rescinded 78 of Joe Biden's executive actions. He is issuing memorandums, proclamations, and executive orders. All three are different. Obviously, executive orders have the force of law. Memorandums are, well, to agencies, and proclamations are important too, more difficult to trace. All of these are consequential. Um, Executive orders can be publicly tracked in the Federal Register and cannot be easily overturned by the Congress, though they can be blocked or challenged. Proclamations and memorandums are more difficult to keep track of. And this whole blitzkrieg of both revocations or signing of orders and issuing of new orders, as of January 28th, Trump had signed 37 executive orders. And these 37 executive orders have lovely names like Unleashing Emergency. Sorry, Unleashing American Energy, Declaring National Energy Emergency, putting America first in international environmental agreements, which means America has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord agreement, unleashing Alaska's extraordinary resource potential, which is basically drill baby drill that Sarah Palin popularized in the 2008 presidential run, um, ending the weaponization of federal government, and so on and so forth. So over to you, Glenn. This is fast and furious. What do you make of all of this? Make sense of it for us.
Okay. Well, I think my name is Cassandra, so no one will listen to a word that I've been saying. But I also think my name might be Narcissus, that I'm convinced that one must look at me as I speak. And perhaps my name is Sisyphus, that I just continue, trying something that is doomed to be misunderstood. Anyway, but I think the story is pretty clear, and it is we are living, as we've said, about international relations in particular over the past year or two, uh, with regard to the United States, and that's how we all live in the world. We're living a hinge moment of history, or a historic turning point, the end of one system and the beginnings or the formation of another. And that obtains with regard to American democracy, I fear, but something I've been, not only I, of course, have been concerned about and warning about for many years. So I want to mention three or four specific moments in the past decades that I think quite clearly paint the picture of the large changes that are occurring, which are into which fit the points you briefly raised and that we're all focused on day to day right now, which is birthright citizenship, executive orders, isolationism, and so on and so forth. But how did we get here, and why is it significant instead of just a series of policies that one agrees with or does not? So the first is, let's go to 1976, and I'm a sophomore in college, and I had in the dining room of the dormitory, it's called a house at Harvard, where I lived, one tends to have a group of friends that one sits with more often than others. And so in the group of friends that I was part of was a fellow who was pleasant, quiet, more focused than I perceived. I think we all recognize him, tease him about the rest of us, certainly than I was. I was stumbling to find my way as a bumbling sophomore. At least that's how I felt about myself, trying to play hockey and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with myself and so on. But this fellow was purposeful, very impressive, very bright, very pleasant, a good fellow, very, very mainstream. And we were all 19, and he was 19 going on 46 or 47 in his demeanor. And who was this? It was John Roberts, who is now our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John was a good fellow. He clearly was focused in a way that almost none of us were. But why do I mention him? Because he has become one of and always has embraced the Republican establishment, responsible, sober, conservative, but that's not an epithet at all from me in his views, an institutionalist, a fine person. What did we see has happened to him, or that he has done in good faith, believing in institutions, believing in essentially small government and conservative values? He has empowered and I think sincerely found ways to rationalize a conservative view which has changed the nature of American democracy, not restored it to an earlier halcyon era, which is what I think he and mainstream Republicans believed they have been seeking, but enabled the alteration, frankly, of the foundations of power and the political process in the country. In his critical moment, probably there have been several, but probably was the election of George W. Bush in 2000 in the Supreme Court decision that essentially gave Bush the presidency and brought in the phase, the rule of the neoconservatives. So he's important because of what the institutionalist and honorable Republicans have, in good faith, enabled and pursued. And I think it's changed even the nature of the institutions that they believed that they were purifying. The second one was about the same time in college. I was a government major. That's called political science, often elsewhere. And there might have been, I don't know, 100 or something government majors. I don't remember in my class. And I was casually knew a fellow who all of us considered was socially maladroit and a bit on the outs, the kind of person, frankly, that others made fun of. Clearly, he was bright, cordial, but he too was on a mission, which all of us viewed as laughable. We literally laughed. We found it seemed so outlandish, and sort of was then dismissed by mainstream people. I think on, well, I'll say the right, such as John Roberts, or I wouldn't have called myself on the left, but apparently on the left, such as myself. And his name is Grover Norquist. And Grover certainly proved all of us wrong and has become one of the critical figures in American political history of the past, halfway behind the scenes. He's not been on the stage all the time. Of the last 50 or 60 years. And Grover started something called, I think, the Wednesday Morning Club. It's a weekly meeting of idea shapers and power brokers of the Republican Party. And he always was quite explicit from the time that I knew him as an undergraduate that he would and his fellow believers in his particular political philosophy was going to reduce the size of the federal government of the United States by literally 50%, so that the federal government would only occupy itself with national defense and border control. And essentially, that was it. We thought that that was lunatic, um, but uh, there should be echoes that you're hearing in what's happening now, as it's the just about the apotheosis of the views of Grover Norquist and his group. Yes.
Glenn, often the words of thinkers are echoed by politicians, sometimes years later, sometimes decades later, sometimes even generations later. And this idea of a unitary executive is not something that is just confined to Grover Norquist. If we go back, we could say, well, look at Hobbes. Hobbes wanted an absolute monarch because he didn't want the chaos of divided power, and he thought that would bring order. So, in a way, it is a theory which is inspired by disparate elements. It's inspired by Milton Friedman, who wanted national parks to be privatized, who believed that if people want national parks, they can pay for it. So combine that the idea that you must have a strong executive for order and the idea that markets should take care of most things and the executive should do a few things such as defense and maybe police and God knows what else. Well, that idea has taken hold. And that idea now, with the emails going around to federal employees, about 2 million of them, offering them an early severance package, very similar to what Elon Musk sent his employees in Twitter. It's a brave new world. Now, having said that, these ideas also gather steam when generally there's a feeling of bureaucratic unaccountability, inefficiency, self serving, self dealing, self enriching. And over a period of time, it is also true, while it is true that these ideas may be extreme and even loony, what is also true is if we look at certain institutions, um, such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, there has been regulatory capture. People go in to the SEC, come out, work for a fund, go in, come out. Uh, and there has been gradually a chipping away of faith in institutions. Um, and their efficacy has gone down as at the same time as the processes have thickened. And so what has happened is that the letter of the law is invariably observed, especially procedural law. But often the spirit of the law is forgotten and ignored. So this is a backlash cause of factors that have built up, I would argue, over decades. And this is something that could happen in the EU tomorrow because it is true that the EU has brought in great benefits in terms of a free trade agreement or a free trade area. The EU is, on the whole, responsible for material progress in Europe to a great degree. If you are a cheesemaker in Italy, you can sell your cheese in Germany without any hassle, and German Riesling can go down to Sicily, and Sicilian wine can go to Spain, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, what is also true is regulation, and we've talked about it multiple times, in the Eurozone is mad. And navigating Brussels is an entirely, uh, entirely uh, different beast altogether. So there could, as we are seeing a reaction here, there could be a reaction one day in other countries too.
Well, we won't talk about the EU too much right now. But yes, Brexit occurred because the Englishmen want to drink their pint rather than their demi liter, basically. But you anticipate a couple of the next points I was going to make. So let's jump from the 70s then to the mid 80s. I was driving in Washington State. I was hiking in the Cascade Mountains, but I had to drive to and from. And the only radio stations that came in then and there, both time and place are relevant, were AM radio stations. And there was a station with this fellow who struck me as really extremist and alarming, frighteningly racist, and incendiary intentionally, which wasn't too surprising that he'd be incendiary, but he was spewing things I thought were truly socially divisive. And his name was Rush Limbaugh, and he became a national phenomenon, the first of many nationally influential talk show pundits on the right. And he came to exist because of technological changes and economic changes in the model of media distribution that were exploited by a fellow named Rupert Murdoch in particular, which has become the greatest opinion shaper in American society over the last 50 years. Then I'll jump ahead to the last moment that I think is enlightening. And it was my own experience, which I've spoken about or certainly alluded to a number of times. And that was, I'm now a CIA officer. It's the early years of the new millennium. And I was involved, as some of you will know, in the enhanced interrogation program. And it was clear to me that what we were being ordered to do was illegal, unconstitutional, outrageous, and really destructive. And of course, and I was told the president has ordered it, and so it's legal. Well, of course, that's not true. Um, However, it is true if it becomes uh, the fact and the reality, and it is true if the theory of the unitary executive that Atul uh, insightfully anticipated I was moving towards becomes the philosophy of government. Now, what is that? Uh, the neoconservatives who came to power for the reasons that I touched upon, the developments I touched upon, believed that the federal government has become intrusive and inefficient and is not in harmony philosophically with how society and government should be in the United States or the way the founding fathers intended it. And it was by design, the American government, by design, inefficient. That's true. But they thought for a superpower, that is not acceptable. So we have to unify power in the executive. And they have inarticulate representatives and highly impressive thinkers, many of whom um, refer to sort of the father of this theory, a jurist, a lawyer named Carl Schmitt. And I've mentioned him before, but he's almost unknown except among the small cognoscenti. And who was Carl Schmitt? Carl Schmitt was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer. He was also a respected because of his intellectual force and coherency, uh, legal thinker. And his writings have become the basis of the unitary executive, it makes no sense to have the uh, choose your bureaucracy telling people to wear a mask. Uh, People should do what they want to do, be left alone, or the president, the executive, should make the decisions and have the power to execute them. So all of these forces at the time, one last thing, in my book, I was trying to deal with the issue of torture and what it has done, not just to the people involved or to the CIA, to American intelligence, American foreign policy, or the American government, but to American society as a whole. I was focused on torture. I did say I consciously underplayed a phenomenally important, ultimately more important and larger issue, and that was what was happening to the nature of American government as a result of the enhanced interrogation program. And I did write at one point in my book, we had become a government of men and not of law. But I underplayed that because I had a different mission. That's the largest thing that has happened as a result of all of these forces. So that finally now, that's the background, the context, and the explanation as to what is happening and why, or really why what's happening is happening. Which gets us to Donald Trump, who is not an aberration. He is an extraordinary individual, certainly. He's becoming historically consequential as he changes the very nature of American democracy. And even if he fails in most of the things he's trying to do, and I think he won't fail in many, he will have, by the effort, uh, changed the not just the discourse, but the structure of our government and our society and the expectations. And one last point before I get to the specific things he's talking about. America has always prided itself to the justifiable, understandable exasperation of most other countries and societies in the world as being unique and the champions of democracy and so on. Well, yes, but also it is true that consistently polling shows that over 40% of the American public has no interest in or support for democracy at all, views it as inefficient and irrelevant. They want a strong leader to solve their problems, and that's it. Democracy is secondary. And so we are finding that we now have a momentary, at least, apotheosis of all of these forces of the last 60 years added onto the strong authoritarian inclinations of a large segment of the American population, probably of any population, but the relevant one right now is America. So that's what's happening, or why what's happening is happening anyway. Sorry, Tool, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I concur to some degree, and but I also think that people vote for populists, so people vote for decisive leaders or leaders who project decisiveness when there has been a period of democratic paralysis. And if we look at countries um, through the last centuries, not just decades, we see that you get a war, you get a decisive war leader, prime minister who has more authority. You have an economic crisis, you get someone who's more decisive. Let's look at the US itself. Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued more executive orders than anyone else. And you could argue, and there were arguments that they were authoritarian, but they were also responding to crises. They were also responding to the change in zeitgeist. So we could be in one of those cyclical phases where, okay, Trump has come in and he shakes things up, but there could perhaps arguably be a backlash against him, and we could go back to a period that is more democratic and one wherein a lot of reforms that are overdue finally get done.
Well, that's a positive interpretation of the arc of history. Um, We're hoping that there is a pendulum that still functions. We'll see if gerrymandering allows the pendulum to swing the other way too,
Well,
but we'll
gerrymandering is one
see.
of those things that needs reform. Campaign finance is something that needs reform. Perhaps a 2 year term for the House of Representatives needs a rethink. There are many things about the functioning of the system that need questioning. I don't know if that'll happen, but that could happen after the shock
Yeah.
and awe of Donald Trump.
Well, it's easier to break things it's easier to knock Humpty Dumpty off the wall than it is to put him back together.
Absolutely.
So we'll see. So I think that I've talked about how we have come to be in the circumstance that we have an authoritarian um, thug as president, but he is decisive, and the people who flesh out the policies and the philosophy of government are many of them are completely coherent and often very bright, and there is strong support for uh, a push to simplify, reduce in size, uh, step back from interfering with the lives of day-to-day citizens. So that's always a strong impulse. Which brings us to now. I won't go there. As Atul talked about, there are dozens of executive orders and memoranda and so on. But what broadly is Trump trying to do, and why will it be significant, even if he fails? I believe. Well, it's the executive orders are in part because Congress is so evenly divided, and you can't get an agenda of any particular single coloration through Congress very successfully at present. Um, but more than that, they are the embodiment of this unitary theory of executive power, and most of the issues are starting with a focus on the essence of what it is to be American. And to be American, it's a clear throwback, as we've talked about, and I think everyone can see, to an America that looks like me rather than like a tool or than my wife. It is certainly culturally um, that of the Anglo-American culture as it has evolved from the colonial period, which will assimilate others so long as they don't become too numerous so that they change the nature of the country. It's more than
So,
melting
so
pot.
long as we
It's,
speak
you know,
English and don't insist on bringing another language.
oh, absolutely, absolutely that. That's right. That's right. Uh, and in that regard, that gets you to the issue of the nature of gender and sex and birthright citizenship, which is clearly written in the Constitution. Birthright citizenship means anyone born on the soil of the United States is an American. And but that, as in fact, what that has now led to, since there are 11 million illegal aliens, and I use the term knowing that it is considered controversial, but I think it is frankly accurate, and it is polemical to attack it. Um, and it's not a value judgment. It should not be. It's come to be so. In any event, that means that of any of the 11 million people here illegally who, as a child, they have American citizenship, and the parent uh, will also come to have American citizenship. So that raises for the people who don't think that's a great, evolution culturally and genetically to outrage and the desire to end it. But it is a constitutional right.
Here's a point. A lot of immigrants don't want more immigrants to come, partly because uh, they do think that if too many of them come, that'll lead to pressure on public services, certainly possibly increase crime. And they feel that if they played by the rules, others who don't shouldn't get a leg up. I'll give you an example of a very dear friend who is in the UK, not in the US. He is in medicine, and he's pretty senior now. And he said something very cutting. He said he didn't leave India for all the other Indians he left behind to follow him to the UK. And he said what he doesn't like now about so many Indians on the streets of Cambridge is that they no longer follow the law. They will not pay heed to the one-way signs or the pedestrian signs. They will drive around their scooties and hit someone. They'll be rude. They'll often be abusive. And this is an Indian who doesn't want, he wants immigration, but he wants legal immigration. And so the point is that it is not just the dominant majority. Often, many immigrants are not entirely for illegal immigration in particular or unrestricted immigration. That's an important point to note as well.
Yeah, well, it's a classic dynamic, certainly in American history. I'm mixing slightly different points, but fundamentally the same. That America go west, young man, because it's the frontier, and then you have beautiful pine smelling air, and no one as a neighbor, and the forest, and all how beautiful this is in great land. And then as you go and you chop down some trees and so on, and then all of a sudden it's no longer the wilderness that you sought, and so you say, well, nobody else can come here anymore because it's you'll destroy the wilderness that I sought. But by seeking, you destroyed. This is an American dynamic. So, okay, everyone says, once you get into the lifeboat, if the next person gets in, we'll all drown. So too bad for you. I mean, this is,
Uh, and Vivek
the hard race.
Ramaswamy is interpreting the Constitution in a new light, and he's saying that the Constitution does not allow for birthright citizenship.
Well, he's a moron. Oh my God. But that's an unfair, that's an unhelpful epithet on my part. Um, I do expect, clear as the Constitution is, that some of the jurists from the various schools of thought that I touched upon in my comments a few minutes ago will be sympathetic to novel interpretations of clearly written English. And even though Trump, I expect, will fail, he will succeed in shifting still the nature and probably reality of citizenship to some extent. So there are all of these executive orders dealing with who it is to be an American and the role of the federal government. So those are the two things I talked about. The size, simply the size of the federal government. So strong, small, autocratic. We can see these things, and he's not insincere. And many people will be quite happy to go along with this. And the fact that the policies often are contradictory is almost irrelevant, except to people who pay attention to trying to be consistent. Because if reducing immigration causes labor shortages and therefore an increase in prices of eggs, let's say, to choose one, what will happen? People will become frustrated, but I anticipate what they will do is the standard thing, which is to blame the government and to look to the people denouncing it, as in Donald Trump and conservative Republicans, I'll call them, as the possible saviors, even though they are the agents uh, of the policy failure. So it's sort of a good situation politically for those folks, and I'm not optimistic that reason will prevail. So this leads to a crisis, a constitutional crisis, a series of them imaginable and in the making here. Let's say the president uses the army on the border to control immigration, as he's already started to do. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. But in the American system of government, there's the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive branch. Who enforces the law? Only the executive branch. So who is to stop the executive? It will be parts of the government. So either the government will ignore the law, undermining the Constitution and having us, as I wrote in my book, a government of men, not of laws anymore, or some elements of the government, whether it's a town council or a state government or Customs and Border Patrol, who knows, some part says, no, what you're doing is illegal and we will oppose it. And how do you oppose it? Either you will, if they literally are using the army, then you either acquiesce, in which case the law is undermined, or you oppose, in which case you are either mutinous, treasonous, or civilly disobedient, which leads to possible violence among parts of the government over a constitutional issue. So this is potentially, quite literally, explosive. Now, I'm taking too long, and I just will jump onto what this implies for foreign affairs. This meaning this unitary theory of executive, the triumph of this whole movement of uh, unitary executive conservative philosophy for foreign affairs. Well, Trump has few fixed views, but he does have some, actually, to be fair to the man. He is a unilateralist, he is a mercantilist, he is an isolationist, and he is a bilateral. He takes sort of a middle kingdom view of foreign affairs, which is we can have bilateral deals so long as I get to set the rules. I, Washington, I, Donald Trump. And
I
so
mean, you could
this
argue
means
he's
that
going back to McKinley in the 19th century. He wants Greenland to be a part of the US.
hmm,
He wants Canada to be part of the US. He wants to take Panama Canal or retake Panama Canal. For all, Panama as a country came into being because Teddy Roosevelt wanted that canal and hived off Panama from Colombia. So he's going back to 19th century, and maybe that is the right model for an imperial power.
well, it takes us back to my hero Thucydides and to the Melian dialogue, where a weaker power was being ordered to do things by the greater Melos by Athens, and the representative of Athens said, "Well, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must." And that
That's one of the great
is
lines of literature.
that's the world prior to 1945, and probably always. And what it means is that the strong, the United States and China and India and the EU, if it can
India is not
cohere.
that strong.
Oh, India is becoming strong, I
We'll
think.
see.
In any event, the strong will do what they will, and all of the countries that think they're cutting great deals now as the global south out from under the obligations of legal obligation and human rights obligations will find themselves when it suits the whims and the purposes of Beijing, Washington, or Delhi, or who I don't know, or Ankara, will find themselves helpless because maybe there's lithium that somebody wants to have, or an entire near continent called Greenland, um, and it's a nastier and more brutal Hobbesian world that is implied and that could easily emerge of spheres of influence and great power and strength from the philosophical views that are now seated in the Oval Office.
You
At
could
which
argue
point,
this
oh,
trend
stop.
this trend began 20 years ago, 2003 Iraq. That was also classic example of the Melian dialogue. The US decided it would invade
Mhm.
Iraq on the extraordinarily dishonest pretext of weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
There was a logic
Well,
to it. It was after 9/11, and Saddam Hussein had been an enemy of the US, at least since the end of the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq war. But at the end of the day, we have been slipping into that Hobbesian world for 20 odd years. It's nothing new.
oh, I think, yeah, I think even more. The Iraq invasion is not the subject we want to talk about. It, uh, I lived it. And the Bush administration, which I opposed on these issues, not that who am I, but was both cynical uh, and exercising great power and unilaterally, as you described, but they also were sincere on many points. I know many of the leaders sincerely believed that Iraq, Saddam was pursuing weapons of mass destruction. That didn't stop them, and that doesn't change the fact that they cynically exploited that point to justify an invasion which they wanted to make in any event. But they actually did believe it. But on which point, which I think we'll stop here. Just to summarize, it's a much more muscular, uh, um, smaller, philosophically and conceptually approach to government, which places laws, frankly, secondary to the exercise of power and will, and that is historic is a shift for the United States as to how much power is held now by people and groups that hold those views, not that the views themselves are novel.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.